We should be okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lee Cheek, and this is our Constitution Day lecture. I know most of this audience, and I know the audience in Statesboro way too well, but we're glad to have everybody here. And we're going to talk about some of the contours of the Constitution. Why is it so important? But look at some of the things that many times are neglected, and that's hard to do in 2023. And I'm reminded of the great American politician born before everyone viewing this right now, except actually, this event took place before everyone here was born, except me. 1964, we had one of the most lopsided elections in American politics, where the incumbent president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, defeated the Republican Barry Goldwater, who was a very distinguished senator from Arizona. Goldwater was distinguished, but he had kind of loose lips. He said things he shouldn't say. He said improving things, but they're actually very, very thoughtful. One of the things he said, he kind of got him in trouble. He said, most Americans think they're experts on everything: politics, religion, constitution, and sex. Well, I'm gonna leave all those other topics alone, except for the Constitution. But he was right. Most Americans think they're experts on the Constitution. For example, especially since the 6th of January and the Trump indictments, everybody knows what's going to happen. Everybody has a prediction based on their expertise on the Constitution. If you don't believe it, just walk out of this room or walk out on our campus in Statesboro and ask them. And, oh yeah, this is going to happen or that's going to happen. The reality is most Americans know very little about the Constitution. They know very little about the Supreme Court, about a third of Americans, for example, can name who the Speaker of the House is at any time. More Americans can name the Three Stooges than they can name 3 justices on the Supreme Court. And I won't even go into the text of the Constitution, having been teaching it for 30 years now and interpreting it. So we're going to turn to the Constitution itself and turn to issues related to it, some big things. Most of these things come from a book that I hope to finish now in retirement. That's about 2/3 of the way through, but that last third has been possible. And it is appropriately the American founding, appropriately for today. And so that's where we're going to head. That's what we're going to talk about. I want to thank Kat, who's really good at planning these events and a big help to the college, and specifically to me in this event, and Courtney, who also had a role in helping put this together. The origins of this book, and really a continuation of my study of the Constitution, took place about 20 years ago. Now 21 years ago. 23 years ago. I'm a little math challenged, not sure about it. We had a national election that was a great controversy. One of the 4 or 5 most controversial in the history of the country. 2000 election, Bush v. Gore, ended up in the Supreme Court case. I was a professor and chair of the political science program at the University of Tennessee. Right before I went into bureaucracy. And so I was helping out with a local news affiliate in terms of translating what was happening as part of the election. But what struck me the most, what shocked me the most, was that a young lady, who was a nice young lady, I not had her in class, but I had seen her on campus, walked up to me and said, "Hey, Dr. Cheek, can you explain what's going on in this election to me? I don't know what's going on. I don't understand it." And she said, "What I'm most interested in is how we elect a president in America, especially this school that you go to get elected president." I said, "Do you mean the Electoral College?" And he said, "That's it." And it scared me. I didn't sleep for a couple nights before I was elected to college. That means that the founders created to elect the president. It scared me so much that even though most of my published works have been on the 19th century and Congress, and I said, I need to go back. I got to recover the founders in my own mind so I can help translate this. And that's where this comes out, a project to recover. That has been kind of my calling since the last 23 years. That is hopefully coming to fruition. So that scared me so much. Now the students, I was teaching a class of the president, and students got They got even with me for telling the story. They bought me a sweatshirt that said Electoral College, which is also the sweatshirt that John Belushi wears in Animal House. And in our faculty, we have one of the world's experts on Animal House, Dr. Vogel. I'm surprised that he is not here, given that we're talking about John Belushi in Animal House. But he may be in class. So all of this inspired me to start working on this book on the American founding, because it's a topic that everyone refers to in America, everyone's an expert on, but in reality, most of us don't know a great deal. And so what I decided to focus on was what we know the least about. Also, in many cases, what I knew the least about, even though as an old political scientist, lifelong student. And two events happened in my life. One, back in the late 90s, I got some grants to host high school seminars, high school teacher seminars, to help them integrate the founding into their classes. And it was a lot of fun. I did it for about 10 years. I got grants and the money ran out, I guess. We did as much as we could. So really kind of helped reinvigorate the founding in my mind, and then a couple hundred high school government and history teachers over that 10-year period. The second thing that really sent me along the lines of returning to the founding was I got a call from a publisher who I published a book with, and the person offered me an opportunity to write a book on the founding. I'm not going to mention the guilty, I'm not going to mention the publisher's name, but somebody I'd worked with before, now the University Press, a private commercial press. And they said, hey, our previous book in this series made $100,000. So it was about constitutional law. So I said, hey, if I can write a popular book on the founding, $100,000, I could basically retire, or not charge the university system maybe for a salary or anything. I can just live large. And I said, that's great. I think he said, can you give me a proposal for the book in 24 hours? So what do you do when you get a great opportunity in life or a great challenge? You call a friend, call a relative. I called a buddy of mine, this gentleman. I said, hey, what do you think? That's a really nice offer. He said, Lee, I just got the same from the same guy. So he called up two people, which was a mistake because we were very close friends. We worked together. And we said, this is not on the up and up. We're not going to do this. Also, he called back in about an hour and said, I want you to say this and this and this in the book. He wanted to program what we said. We said, no way, Jose, we're not going to do that. That's completely dishonest. We're going to go to an academic publisher. So we went to Bloomsbury, an English publisher, and now we're going to Indiana to Notre Dame. So this is the fruition of a long mission to try to make from an academic perspective, recover part of the founding, part of the Constitution that has been lost to some degree or neglect. Okay, so as a professor, I'm going to start this, as you might expect, with a quiz. We're going to take a quiz together in about 30 seconds, okay? We're going to see how many of these people, for example, that we can identify. And Kat, I think I'm going to
at the computer.
have to do it at the computer.
No, pointed at the computer.
Okay. We're having a.
Did you push a button?
Nope, it was working. Just let me. But we're going to have a little quiz here. It won't manually either. Let me see if it. Okay, we're going to move this. It appears there it is. Okay, I'm going to have to use that. Okay, now it's working. All right. Okay, so take a couple seconds, look at each one of these figures, and as a kind of little test. And Professor Mansell is going to help us too. See who we recognize. Anybody recognize this gentleman? He's on a currency.
Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson, the sage of Monticello, president, two-term president, the author of the Declaration of Independence in large part, as well as a bunch of other stuff. Probably our most famous president, right? He's the person who President Kennedy in the 1960s, when he hosted a dinner for Nobel laureates, he said the only time there had been that much brain power in the White House was when Jefferson died in the White House alone. That's, sort of, okay. How about this guy? Close. He was the recording secretary at the Constitutional Convention. a president, Thomas Jefferson's best friend. He's 5'4", kind of like for those of us that are height challenged. This is James Madison. Most Americans know James Madison. Most Americans know Dolly Madison, maker of the little pies and cakes. And I actually think it's named it after her. She was from North Carolina. Okay, now it comes really hard. Anybody, does this look like anybody you may have ever heard about? His name's there's a university in Northern Virginia that is his namesake. He is probably the richest American at the time of the Constitutional Convention. This is George Mason. Still, and really the person who is often called the father of the Bill of Rights. Because he insisted on a Bill of Rights. He does not sign it. He goes to the Constitution, he doesn't sign. He goes back to Virginia. I'm not going to accept that document because it doesn't protect the rights of citizens. But he's going to insist on that, and that will take place in 1801, the first Congress. So George Mason. Now the trickster, the hardest one. His name is written here, his signature. Just look at it. He looks like maybe a beetle, former beetle, right? Or Herman's, one of those groups from Stephen. Here's this is the trickiest one of a lot. This is Luther Martin. Luther Martin also will be at the Constitutional Convention, help write the Constitution. In fact, he will create the Electoral College, the way we elect presidents. Since I've been making fun of the electoral, not fun of the Electoral College, making fun of things related to it. Luther Martin will be the author of the idea of the Electoral College. Luther Martin was also one of America's great lawyers. He is a delegate. I don't know why I have all these Virginians. Virginia, Maryland. There's many people I can have here, but this is one of them. Luther Martin is one of America's great lawyers. After the convention, after the Constitution comes into place, he will argue a number of cases before the most famous cases of the early Supreme Court. He's also one of America's great drinkers. So if we have any students listening to this, do not follow his example. It was said in Annapolis, which was the political capital of Maryland, not Baltimore, that if you saw a guy walking down the street with a bottle, it was probably Luther Martin, and it was probably him. So he was one of America's great lawyers, but also one of America's great drinkers. But these are sort of some of the people. He doesn't need to be rediscovered. He doesn't need to be rediscovered. He doesn't need it. But a significant portion of the people who write this Constitution will be recovered and their ideas. Okay. Part of the studying the Constitution and really studying how it comes into being in America, it's realizing there are really two American original foundings. One we know about a lot, Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Cotton, Thanksgiving, Native Americans, turkey, pumpkin pie. I don't think that's part of it, but you get the picture. Okay. The other is equally, almost simultaneous, is Jamestown, which now we know more about within the last decade than we have for hundreds of years, because largely some really quality archaeological research. But they are very similar. But we have sort of some original divisions, original different points of view from the very, very beginning. So our political tradition, our constitutional tradition, starts out in different ways. And so that's one of the focuses that I think we need to think of, is that a big part of my project is looking at the two together, seeing how they're different, how we evolve. Okay, another part that tends to be abused in some ways. I say this as an ordained United Methodist clergy. Well, I just retired from the Methodist Church about 3 months ago, after 39 years. But is the role of religion. No other country has quite the same kind of role of religion in the shaping of its political tradition and its constitution as America. But when we think of the religion and the Constitution, religion and American constitutional tradition, this term comes into play. Everybody heard that wall of separation? Anybody heard that term? It comes that religion and politics should be separate. In reality, that's not from the constitutional era, actually, technically. That's a letter Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, saying religion and politics should be separate. The real legacy of the connection of religion and politics, and religion, in fact, was the dominant influence in most of the modern era and many countries. But in our case, it's unique because 53 of the 55 men who create this Constitution in 1787 were members of a religious denomination of some variety. Whether they were very faithful, Thomas Jefferson obviously was a vestryman, which means you're an insider, you're a member of a Episcopal church. But he's not particularly religious. He called God in the Declaration of Independence that Matt and I have studied. He calls God by different names, supreme providence, other things that not any major religion today would use that kind of term. On the other hand, some of the people who were not religious, the most famous is Ben Franklin, pictured here in the book cover. Ben Franklin was not a religious person. He didn't have any belief system, but he loved going to church. He's, by the way, the oldest person at the Constitutional Convention where the Constitution is going to appear. And he loved going to church. It was said in Philadelphia in the hot summer of 1787 that when the church door was opened, any church door, usually Ben Franklin's hands were on the doorknob. Now think about it. There's probably a practical reason for that. We're not sure. He was in his 80s, oldest person at the convention, and he was what some of our students and students watching you agree with. I hope agree with my terminology. He's what we call a player. Professor Eaton's surprised that I know that term. I didn't realize that. But he was a player, and that chicks loved him, and he loved chicks, or I think he loved everybody. But it's also the most social place in the course of a week that you outside the pub or someplace. So he was actually a participant in religion, whether he was actually didn't affirm any particular set of religious beliefs. So religion and the American Constitution are very closely related, but much more nuanced than the extremes. Extremes say, well, in American politics today, religion has no role in American politics. On the other hand, you have certain religious groups that say they're intimately linked, religion and politics, and it can't be separated. When we do, all things are going to Hades in a handbasket. So someplace in between that influence, especially in terms of there are a lot of things that a purely religious constitution would have included that this one doesn't. And that's part of my argument. Founders and a humane economy. Now, I don't, by that, and this is often understudied, is that the creators of the Constitution had a very deep knowledge of economy, political economy. They had studied this very deeply. Not all of them were businessmen or clergy, almost everybody's represented. But they also had a deep attachment to how economies work, how economies are productive, how wealth is created. That didn't mean that they were wild free market people like we think of in the 21st. They weren't libertarians at all. They believed, may need government regulation in some cases of the economy, but certain kinds of things need to be limited. But they also had a very deep view of how economics worked. And one way that worked is the creation of wealth. But they all read Adam Smith, the great father of modern capitalism, great creator of modern capitalism. They also knew that at the same time as they were meeting in Philadelphia, the Northwest Ordinance was also being crafted by the Second Continental Congress. And they basically say government should stay out of the role of business and allow business to work unencumbered. Now, whatever that means, it's taken us a long time and we haven't resolved that issue. But that basically government should not serve a regulatory function in terms of the economy. Economy should be allowed to make wealth. So they basically believe in a humane economy, not radical libertarians, but a free economy, free exchange of goods. Okay. This is one of the most vital topics of my project, and I think really the Constitution. It's what kind of government we're going to set up for posterity. Almost the founders, to a person, the creators of our Constitution, thought that they wanted a Constitution that would last. They'd seen constitutions come and go, see constitutions fade, and that the great constitutions of the world, just like Aristotle and Plato had said, they said have limitations on the role of government. So they're going to be strong advocates for the limitations of political authority, but they're also going to believe at the same time that they're a necessary amount, a vital functional government in the role of that political society. you're gonna look back to the English Constitution. That's really one of the main focuses of our project, is look at how the English Constitution is translated. And our Constitution doesn't just pop up. It's, as some of the more extreme defenders of the convention say, one of the terms they use called the miracle at Philadelphia. Well, it may have been a miracle, but there's also, as opposed to the opposite view, which is that the Constitution was largely ineffective and largely ideas of old white guys that really didn't understand anything. Well, that's certainly not true. So somewhere between those two extremes, the worship, the hagiography of the Constitution and its dismissal. I heard Lawrence Rodon on television that the founders didn't understand democracy. Nothing could be less true. They understood it much better than he did, but he does, but it's just a different understanding. But also, if you're studying, and Matt, you may have encountered this as a young whippersnapper at Sandersville High School, this Lockean founding that John Locke wrote the American Constitution. That's an often account of the American Constitution, where in reality, Locke influenced the Constitution. He actually wrote a Constitution for South Carolina. You want to know where South Carolina has all the problems? No. Seriously, he wrote a Constitution, and he did influence the American creation of the Constitution, but the English tradition had much more influence, much more powerful example. Okay, so the founders really give us this idea of shared power, limiting political authority, but at the same time allowing for logical political power that would provide for stable society. The Declaration. The Declaration is probably one of the most beloved and most, at the same time, most abused documents in American politics. And Matt's already studied it this semester. The Declaration is a great vital statement of American political principles. However, it does not create a government in any way. Most of it is a list of bad things the king has done, like putting soldiers in people's houses, having juries just made up of the king's friends, so you're always guilty. So if Dr. Chevalier and I go up at court, which we would never do, we'd be, I might, Dr. Chevalier, but we would be immediately guilty if we had done anything against the government, because the king's people would be making a decision. The Declaration is very powerful. It does not, it's a statement of political principle, but it does not establish a government. And that's one of the key arguments that we make in the book. In fact, Jefferson called it the holy document, but he also acknowledges that the writer, of course, there's a committee that helps, but the main author realizes its limitations. We spend more time kind of unpacking the Articles of Confederation, which is the second, follows the Declaration. It's the first American Constitution, and the Constitution under which we win the Revolutionary War. People dismiss the Articles because they didn't have the power to tax. That's standard among social science. Oh, it's weak, it didn't have the power, but we won a war under it. So we talk about that, talk about the original Constitution, and it's also a very serious defense of civil rights and civil liberties in its own way. And in terms of political authority, its second article said all powers not given to the national government are retained by the states. So as a source of sovereignty, the articles defer to state power, which is, we think, are very powerful. Argument and one of the enduring importance that we don't go away. By the way, if you look at the Code of U.S. Law today, which is a later document, it starts with Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation. These are all considered part of American law and American constitutional process today. Okay, spend a lot of time talking about the great event, Philadelphia Convention. But that's only half the story. The main focus of my argument and the argument of the book is that Philadelphia Convention, May to September 17th, yesterday was the anniversary, is the convention itself, which didn't meet for a couple of weeks because folks kind of late showing up. But it is an epochal event, but it's only half the story. The other half of the story is called ratification. Okay. The other problem is who were these people? The ones that we identified: Jefferson, Madison, George Mason in the earlier slide. Everybody knows them. Everybody knows Hamilton. Okay, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But there were many leaders before the convention itself. Americans who helped develop this Constitution, helped develop the ideas of shared powers, separation of powers, a limited executive, civil rights and civil liberties, same things we value so much there. It started before with individual state constitutions. Almost every state had a state constitution. In fact, a number of states, North Carolina, Virginia, they had their own Bill of Rights before the American Constitution. Pennsylvania had its own Bill of Rights. This happens to be my favorite because they had a provision that no other state constitution had. It guaranteed every person the right to hunt and fish, which would be very appealing to many people in South Georgia, right? To guarantee that. The usual suspects. That's usually not a complimentary term. I mean it to be complimentary in terms of what I encourage people to think about the Constitution. Hamilton, Madison, John Jay. And I mean, and these people are always praised in American society. Jefferson gets the guy beat up because of Sally Hemings affair and other things, but his genius cannot be really matched by anybody else. He's not actually at the Constitution Convention. He's in France as our Minister of France. But he's advising his friend Madison Hamilton. Hamilton is beloved, although he wasn't all the time that great a guy. I mean, and he's part of that hagiography, that worship in the 21st century. How? Well, we all know the Chernow book that was made into the Lin-Manuel show, musical, and Hamilton's a hero. He's unstoppable. He's the American spirit embodied in one person. After all, you know that move, that great song he sings in the musical. And he goes, shut up. See, all that choreography I learned being married to a dancer. But he's a perfect American, unstoppable, hardworking, finishes the mission. Well, he did a lot of stuff. He ends up being, of course, shot in a duel with Aaron Burr, but he's also a great figure at the Constitutional Convention. He will be the strongest advocate for creating a new government. In fact, some of his ideas, he wanted the first president to serve a life term. Sounds a lot like King, exactly that, which we won't accept. That won't be. So these people need to be. We sort of interpret these key figures in a different way. The ones best known, the celebrities, the ones that make them become president, the ones that are on coinage, the ones that are on stamps. But we also look at the other other half of the people who are there, what we call the anti-federalists, people who oppose the Constitution, except and if only it would contain a Bill of Rights. And these were, by the way, the Federalists are almost, you can call these folks Federalists, they're in every state, anti-Federalists were in every state. Just to give Luther Martin, for example, would be best considered, I think, an anti-Federalist. Some of the other people, so I don't leave out anybody, would be people like, and of course, many of them, there's 55 people there altogether, only 35 at one time. At any one time is the highest number that was there at one time. People come and go and have family relations, that sort of thing. Would be people like George Mason, ultimately. I should characterize him in the previous slide. So one key part of the book is kind of looking at all these people, how they come together, different ideas, and how they help develop the Constitution. Female founders, almost totally left out. And that's not because I'm politically correct. It's not because I have to trying to look cool. There's a significant story here that should be told from honest scholars, on an honest scholar point of view. Not that any people before us have been dishonest, but some of the people we need to think about are people like Mercy Warren, who was the kind of historian, contemporary at the time, historian of the Revolution and what follows. Very major figure, almost unknown to most Americans, but a very major figure. Abigail Adams, probably the smartest of the whole Adams clan in terms of knowing what to do, sentiments, being able to judge people. And also people like Molly Pitcher, who is one of the stars, one of the heroines of the Battle of Monmouth during the Revolution itself. And Monmouth, New Jersey, one of the great battles of the Civil Revolutionary War. There was also a second Tea Party called the Wilmington Tea Party. Bigger, more influential. Port of Wilmington, almost all a female event. But the males in Boston get all the attention. So these are stories that haven't been told. We try to unpack these stories, try to integrate them to the larger constitution. So part of the revolt, the revolt actually was significantly empowered by the female founders. So that's a big part of our argument, a big part of the overall story. Okay, second part, Constitutional Convention. That's everything you ever hear about. All Americans, everything happened. God came down, gave us this Constitution of Philadelphia. Wow, everything's wonderful. There's a second part that I think we and my colleague thinks that is even more important. It's often not told. We call this the ratification. What the Constitution required, Article 7, is that this document coming out of Philadelphia, our Constitution under which we live now, would then go to 12 states. One state doesn't participate. They're still a little bit weird. Rhode Island. I'm kidding. Rhode Island's a great state. They do agree to that portion. Anyway, 9 out of 12 states have to approve, and it's one of the great debates in American history and American politics of all time. 12 have to approve. These are 3 of the state constitutional conventions to approve the Constitution that we spend time on. These are 3 of the greatest debates. We have the records of these debates, and my friend Sean Busick and I unpack these. By the way, these debates are very close. We came very close to not adopting this Constitution. Give you an example. Give you a little story, a little vignette of this. In Virginia, which is probably the most powerful state, with Massachusetts and New York, James Madison, future president, goes there to defend this Constitution. He's been at the convention. He is the recording secretary. He knows it better. He lost a big debate that he wanted at the convention. He goes there and makes the argument, please, what's the Constitution, said we got to have it. But at this same convention, in Virginia, were anti-federalists, people who opposed the ratification of the convention. People like Robert E. Lee's father, Harry Lighthorse, who will eventually die, one of the great heroes, the cavalry hero of the American Revolution. These guys are battle-worn superheroes of the Revolution. Madison comes there and says, we need this Constitution, we need to keep going. And I said, why? We won the war. We kicked the English butt. We didn't need it. We don't need to increase the power of government. It's because it's going to take away from the liberty and the freedom of the American citizens. Patrick Henry, who had been a great pre-revolutionary, our Revolutionary War era figure, he's going to say basically the same thing. So it's a tough decision, and it is only allowed because the Federalists and Anti-Federalists agree. Federalists agree with it. They will accept this Bill of Rights. Anti-Federalists agree they'll accept the 7 articles of the structure of government. There we have confidence. It's kind of these stories that we try to tell because that we try to explicate because they're not as well known. Okay, some of the heroes we look at, I've already talked about. Both sides, well known, typically Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Also, during the Revolution, under the Articles of Confederation, under the Continental Congress, we had presidents. My friend Dr. Busey argued that those presidents should be counted too, because they were technically American presidents. Presidents of the Continental Convention, Continental Congress, and under the Articles of Confederation. So George Washington was not the first president. That's just kind of unsettled people a little bit, make them think about really the larger picture. There are about 5 of these guys. One was from South Carolina, so John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, was prudent, thoughtful, ultimately an anti-federalist, but he will support the political tradition after these changes. I mentioned George Madison, the richest man in America. And then we throw some jokers in there. There ought to be jokers in any deck, right? More than one. We got more than one here on this campus. I may be one of them. Okay. But Luther Martin, great American lawyer, anti-federalist, we just talked about. And also there are 3 people, delegates from New York. Hamilton, who's famous, and the other 2, they were anti-federalist. Hamilton's most strongest anti-federalist, Yates and Lansing, 2 others, they come to the Constitutional Convention. They say, hey, y'all are creating something to might endanger our rights and our liberties. We're going back to New York. We're not signing this Constitution. The great anti-federalists made a statement, a powerful statement. So these are people, we pick up on some lost causes because they ultimately are gain costs, C.S. Eliot said. There are no permanently lost costs. Okay, slavery, another very important issue. This was, I think, Martin, the commentator's comments about slavery the other night. Well, every colony at the time of the Constitutional Convention had slaves. Slavery was part of the American political landscape. Horrifically so, horribly so, but we have to be forthright, and we talk about that nature. And some states did not want slavery, so they were happy to have all the majority of slaves in the American South. So that's also part of this story of slavery in the United States and American politics. Also, what the founders did do is they limited the transatlantic slave trade. It was to end, and it did end in 1808 as part of the Constitution. It's in the Constitution. So they tried to influence it. But what happens, and that was largely Dutch and British slave traders bringing slaves from the west coast of Africa to the United States. But what happens after the transatlantic slave trade ends? It becomes an internal slave trade within the United States. Now, in the Caribbean and in South America, places like Cuba, there were a larger number of slaves, and some of those would make their way in the United States too. But slave trade founders made an effort. They didn't solve this problem. They didn't solve a lot of other problems. So sometimes the class students will say, "Gee, founders didn't really know much. They didn't solve it. They didn't do anything about space travel." That's right. They didn't know anything about technology. They had to deal with the world and the knowledge they had. And that's part, when we talk about the founders also, many founders at the convention went to slavery. But they would come to some system that were not being encouraged. But there were others who, for example, South Carolina's, two of South Carolina's delegates at the convention, Pinckney, for example, argues very strongly that it's not going to work on this simplification. So it's part of the dilemma, largely unresolved, but there is an effort to try to limit or come some way out of it. What are our legacies? What do we learn? Why is this Constitution continually important? Well, obviously, it's still the political system we live under. It's been changed a number of times. One of those changes is prohibition. We retracted, went back to drinking, thank God, in moderation, all things. Just to say that. I don't want President Schechter to say that she people really drinking. But also the idea of dissent, idea you can question, idea that you can, and so we have a significant dissenting tradition. Anti-federalists are really the founders of that. And it doesn't always work out in one political agenda or that sort of group that protested against Wall Street a few years ago, even maybe labor protests that are happening right now are efforts to ask an existing order to refine and improve it. That's part of the American experience. I think ultimately the legacy of founding is a defense, the love, and the support of liberty, of human freedom, imperfectly so, but working it out over time. And so it's that liberty which we live under now, and that liberty which I now bestow upon you to ask any questions, refutations, commentaries, or go to lunch, any of those options. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for Constitution Day, and thank the founders for what they have bequeathed to us. Thank you. So I'll open the floor for any questions.
I have one. The thing that puzzles me so, and you know where I'm from, right? I'm Cuban, and I grew up in socialism. Well, not grew up, but I was born into that system. I have memories. And it baffles my mind that we are in a situation right now where we have big business, we have big tech, we have big media, we have these agencies, and we have no mechanism other than the votes. And that is if it's if we have a fair election. And it just blows my mind that we're in this place.
Well, I think one thing relating to the founders certainly did not envision, and with good reason, there would be this kind of nexus in American life between, it's not just America, you have this in other Western democracies, you have it in totalitarian systems like China, this nexus between, for example, drug makers, big pharma and government that really support each other. Or as President Eisenhower said, military industrial complex, this growth would be so large and so powerful. And the founders, I think, would have been very suspicious of the easy acceptance of that, which ultimately tends, from their perspective, if you link political and economic liberty together, that end up threatening both economic and political liberty over time. Is there a solution to that? Well, not an easy one, but the founders knew they should be living. A faithful response would be to reinvigorate that effort to try to limit the influence of those complexes, which I think do threaten the Constitution and American political liberty ultimately. And I say that as a veteran. The military is too big, and most times too expensive. And while we're very close to some military installations, and having, I think that's our service. I think we have the largest land base as part of our service area. It's close to it. It still can potentially threaten liberty by taking away the resources of the country, involving the citizens of the country. And while they're not intrinsically bad, they can corrupt that to natural limits.
You know, I remember reading your article not long ago, and you said, you quoted that our Constitution was intended for a moral people. And I remember when we're talking about freedom of speech, and today people are canning it as hate speech or this kind of speech or that. I think what the intention was with freedom of speech was, like you were saying, to petition the government to do better. But where does freedom of speech and seditious speech and counter Constitution speech, at what point, what was the intention behind that freedom of speech?
That's a great question, Alice. Certainly, the founders were in a world where there were limitations on speech. Certainly, for England, France, the Prussian world, there were also limitations in speech, and the founders knew. The founders knew that there were times when speech had to be in some ways either limited or restricted, just so everybody had the chance to speak. And so it wasn't just the king, it wasn't just the political elite, but the citizens should have a basic freedom of speech. Be able to say what they wanted when they said it. Also petition the government, which is really, to me, a kind of speech. Have political rallies, as long as they didn't try to overthrow the government. So their idea was liberty restrained, not liberty in the most extreme. Although we have people who argue, for example, if you look at the 100 years of American Civil Liberties Union, they argue for basically an unrestricted power of speech. My idea, and I think our mission, is to sort of show what the founders really believed, and that was the possibility that there may be cases that you would have to restrict speech, because the English were restricting our speech, our ability to travel, our ability to do so many other things. But not a sort of libertine view of completely unrestricted. And the Supreme Court, of course, in the last 240 years has said, there's many things that you can limit in terms of speech. And most Americans have agreed with that, seeing that part of our constitutional tradition. Especially in speech that hurts other people without reason, without purpose. It's similar to kind of criminal procedure as evolved over time. Basically, your house is a sacred place in terms of the Constitution. You've got to have, police have to think that you have the possibility of engaging in legal activity to search, and then they have to have, of course, a probable cause kind of argument, and they have to have a warrant. And so your house is, people's homes are special status in the law because of that. Now, it's very disconcerting to students, like, and Matt was not bothered by this himself, I should say Matt was this, is that when I tell students that educational institutions are given special freedom, that's the wrong term to use, special leeway in terms of search and seizure, which is a little bit unusual, and then maybe doesn't fit completely in that larger tradition. And students say, well, why can there be drug dogs in the dorm? Well, Supreme Court's allow educational institutions that freedom. Why did they search my locker in high school? Well, because the Supreme Court's allowed them. The tradition really is to protect citizens' rights and liberties, but not permanently unrestricted in any way. That's not a perfect answer in any way, but kind of attempt to kind of answer your very good question.
Just like the Supreme Court's ruled 2 or 3 times that, and one time in time that the danger that people's rights can be limited.
Yes, yeah, especially like in wartime. These are usually meant to be temporary. They're, it has happened. And the other case where people get buried, one of those contestable cases in all the whole American Constitution is the Second Amendment, of course, the right to own and right to personal gun ownership. But the language of the amendment itself actually refers to militia in the state. That's traditionally the way it's been interpreted over the 240 years. Well, the Supreme Court ruled about 15 years ago that personal gun ownership was also protected in part of that. And actually, it had been a real big issue. People just had their guns, they did. But of course, with the expansion of the sheer number of guns and school shootings, all the other issues, it keeps coming back in play. And it's brought home to me as a person who grew up in the North Carolina mountains, studying is that we're talking about really kind of a different environment that we're talking about now. And I see that when I drive to Chatham County and see the Daniel Defense and you see all these other makers. We're dealing with kind of a different environment. I just thought people should be able to defend themselves too. Those lines have been blurred now because different kind of weaponry, and we have so many other issues that perhaps create more tension, and those are used inappropriately. All these things. So yeah, their vision to me is still intact. It's just Americans are facing so many different challenges that we can see their prudence and their self-restraint amidst those kind of crises. We're probably better off as a society, fully consistent. Same way the institution of government. They were meant to serve certain functions. One of those was to keep government power in check. And that's the whole purpose of impeachment removal in the second article of the Constitution. It was not meant to be kind of a punishment or a political toy, like we're using now. You impeach my president, I'm gonna impeach yours. And that doesn't help us. It's just great, even though it's probably, I do not think, for example, President Biden said he's not going to be impeached, probably not going to be moved. Well, we have to use that very carefully, regardless of the president's party, because that tends to detract from that founder's view in many ways. It also probably isn't just good politics. So that's a good question. I went off on other topics. I'm sorry, but they were related some way, somehow. Okay.
Definitely agree with what you were saying. And assume that everyone's going to be do what's right for the moral good. Everyone has a moral intact. Otherwise, we go back to point of view.
Yeah.
More fairly wicked and evil, and then nothing works anyway because nobody puts out the best. So you always have to assume that everyone's going to do. The majority of people are going to do what's best for people.
At least that's a great point. And Matt, you built on that, is that the founders thought it would be a virtual citizen. Citizen would do the right thing And they have enough personal restraint not to do the wrong thing too often, to undermine the political system. That's, I think, an excellent point. And so as Matt and I have talked about in class, what would happen in a case where the American people were less virtuous or less committed to doing the right thing? If you want to just put it in not a sophisticated philosophical way, but just a simple, what happens if they lost that? And people actually make those arguments pretty significantly. Today, I still have a lot of faith in American people, but I do realize that is an ongoing issue. I try to jokingly and say, what happened to Janet Jackson philosophy takes control? What have you done for me lately? I'm not going to answer, but the idea that the individual is all that matters, who cares about it. And there are people too that approach, but that's not to me the main thrust of the Constitutional Commission. Really good point. Dr. Ransel still with us? Is he still there?
I am. I'm here. Yes, sir.
Very good. Have I committed too much heresy today?
No, I've been. Your presentation has been an experience. Has been enthusiastic. Even when you mentioned Luther Martin, that's one of the, the founders who, number one, I don't know much about, and so I'm going to have to look more at him. But yeah, it's a very enthusiastic presentation that I hope your students there are appreciative of all the time.
Well, thank you, Daniel. We got one superstar here, Matt, who unfortunately I'm trying to convince to go into political science. He's wanting to do other things like go into science. Sorry, not so I'm not discouraging him from anything, but we're encouraging him. Thank you very much. And yeah, Luther Martin is kind of a personal mission of mine. He's one of the people who's most neglected, and I think is very important. In fact, I'm going to send this to you, Daniel, but everyone who's here in person is getting a special prize. Some additional information on that Luther Martin. It's just because I realize that he's one of those people that's completely neglected. For the most part, and I'm sorry to do that again. Matt will be assessed on that later. I'm kidding you. So that's a good point. He's one of my favorite people. I think I'm going to take some of the Virginians, if I were to give this talk again, take some of the Virginians out and put some other folks.
And I just have one little comment too, if I may.
Please, sir.
When you think about, Constitution Day, September 17th, I'm always reminded of the speech that Benjamin Franklin made, or Mr. Wilson made on his behalf, basically saying that when you think about this Constitution, when you assemble, kind of paraphrasing what he's saying, when you assemble a number of men with the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble those men with their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, their selfish views. And from this, can we have basically a perfect document? And he says, basically, I think we do. I think we do, and it will astonish our enemies. And I think about the weight on the shoulders of these individuals, these 39 individuals who signed this document on that day, and actually what they're doing. Obviously, you mentioned this briefly, I think, this idea of having this convention in secret. This isn't some, group of men who are coming together and creating this government out of thin air. And this is here to the people. This is what you have. You must submit to it. That's, the states have to approve this. It goes back to this national versus, federal question, I guess. So again, just think about to the people viewing and the students there and everyone, think about the weight. You are there at this convention and you're weighing whether or not you are actually, number one, going to continue to stay at this convention the entire time, or two, if you're going to sign your name to this document and what you're actually doing when you do that. So I just want to kind of mention that because I always think of Benjamin Franklin here at the end.
That's a great point. They had no idea what the ultimate product would be, and also at the same time, what their legacy would be. So I think that's an excellent point, Daniel. One of the things, and I'll say this as we'll conclude, is that 91 had a great opportunity after the Berlin Wall fell, 91 and 92, and the former Soviet Union fell apart. A lot of scholars from America and Western Europe went to Eastern Europe to help those countries that recently gained their independence to write a constitution, a new constitution, because the old Soviet one was a complete fib, like a chicken in every pot. That's FDR in America. It's something of that type, like a month's vacation. They had all these rules that they couldn't deliver what they promised. So what struck me, and I was in graduate school, I was a junior member of this group. I was just a young punk. Cat may still say I'm punk, with good reason, but not young anymore, sorry. But I was struck by the number, and I was in Czechoslovakia, is that the people who ask us, can we have a constitution like yours? Because of the legacy of the founders and the Constitution. And my response was always no. I mean, we're glad for you to have, we'll help you with sort of what we know as political scientists, but at the same time, and it's got to fit your culture. Got to fit your political culture, fit your goals, fit what you want. So you never really know what the ultimate product is going to be. If you're revising or you create a new constitution. And so we're still in that, and we have to hope that we can continue to be faithful to those ideas that allow the Constitution to continue. And this happens to me. It's and I don't want to belabor this. It's coming to me very profound way, because between those two extremes of people who love the Constitution, worship it perhaps too much, and people want to dismiss the Constitution, say it's outdated, we need a new one. Is the desire to maintain those great provisions that are allowed for American liberty, for the existence of our republic, which we indebted to the founders in their love of liberty. Okay, I think I have finished my mission, and I thank you all so much for coming. There's never great attendance at this event, but we have a good experience anyway. And thanks to Professor Mansell for his insights and presence, and so I'm now announcing today that I am the executive director of the Luther Martin Foundation. If anybody, and as a missionary organization to promote the teachings of Luther Martin, only the teaching, not the other parts of the personality analysis. I'm kidding, but seriously, thanks to everybody for coming. Thank you for your insight. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Dan, man. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming. That's really great.